Welcome, listeners, to Cygnal Pulse Pod, actually our 77th episode. I think like our fifth one or so on video, and joined by Cygnal Pollster John Rogers here. We're talking about our May National Voter Trend Survey, which was taken May 6th through the 8th, to give you a little bit of time perspective there. And it was 1,500 likely general election voters, again, 2026 midterm general election that we're talking about. In this episode, we're going to cover a few things. First, what are the 5 top takeaways from this poll? Second, a new special segment that we're trying called The Soft Spot. So please give us some feedback on that if you think we should continue with that. And as always, we will close out with picking some winners and losers in the lightning round at the end. So let's get to the data. First topic, John, is Trump's first 100 days. We're a couple weeks past that milestone. If you look at the public polling, you would think he's absolutely cratering, but our data actually shows a lot of resilience and rising optimism, especially among some key voter groups that you would normally go to the crosstab with your fingers crossed, hoping you didn't degrade with that voter group, trying to put your coalition together. And I would say that a lot of those crossed finger voter groups actually are doing better for Trump right now than you might expect. So we've got Trump at 47% approval, 51% disapproval. That's only a -4 net image, which, thinking back to Trump's first term, that's an incredibly huge difference in first term to this term. Highest approval since February, up with married women, up with union households. I dug in a little bit on the gender side, John, and then I want your perspective on some of this. Among all females, he's gone from -22 favorability in April to -14 this month. I mean, that's an 8-point shift among all women, 8-point shift to his favor among all women here. And then we got 45% of the country saying that we're headed in the right direction. And that is a high since we started doing this in June of 21. So, do you see Trump's numbers holding up? And where do you think there might be some cracks emerging?
Yeah, Brent, I think that there's continues to be a disconnect between how the national media covers Trump's second administration and then how voters actually feel on the ground out in middle America. And so, if you look at news headlines from CNN or New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, there's all this angst about the direction of the country and angst about Trump's actions. But really, his image has been very stable. As you already said, his net image in this poll that we did is -4. You rewind the clock to January, it was the exact same, -4 net image. And so there's a lot of stability in his image. Look, everybody knows who Donald Trump is, right? The man is not going to say something that is really going to surprise anybody at this point. Everybody knows what his strengths are, what his weaknesses are, what his personality is. And when you look at, if you go back to July of last year, which was right after the debate between Biden and Trump, where, Biden face planted and all of the lies that the top Democrats in DC had been saying about his capacity, they were shown to be lies. Right after that, we did a poll in July. 71% of people in the United States said that the country was on the wrong track, and only 24% said that they felt like the country was headed in the right direction. And in this poll, comparing it to July of last summer, there is a upward net 40% swing in voter optimism.
I mean, that's huge. I will say is you look under the hood, because that's one thing that, if you're just a consumer of polling and you're just looking at what public polling is coming out, you're looking at the top lines. Those top lines can get really bouncy. And if they're changing, you don't really understand why they're changing. It could actually just be bad sampling. But I looked at something because, Donald Trump is sitting in the White House because of ticked off young, diverse working class voters. And, when we say working class, we mostly mean not college. Do not have a 4-year college degree or higher. And I went and looked at the trend over the last couple months among college and non-college voters on his image, and he's actually moved -7 points with non-college voters. A few months ago, he was at +4 with them on his image. Now he's at -3. And interestingly, a lot of the movement that has happened to his positive has actually been college-educated voters going from 38.58 to 42.56, which is a +6 improvement. And this kind of breaks the narrative of what you're seeing right now in the media, which is, all non-college voters have fully moved to the Republican Party, and all college-educated voters have moved fully away from the Republican Party. And we're kind of seeing right now where there's actually a realignment of the realignment on Trump's image. And I'll bring out in a couple other points too when we get further into the podcast here, of where these non-college voters are actually coming somewhat off of Donald Trump, and college-educated voters are moving to Donald Trump. And it's happened too many months in a row for us to say, well, that was just a sampling anomaly within a single month.
Right. And it's important to keep in mind of where we are, right? We're in 2025. It's a midterm. Normally in a midterm, the president's party is going to suffer, is going to have kind of a weak midterm. And so the numbers that we're kind of going through in this poll really show a lot of optimism, I think, for the White House and for Republicans in D.C., where you look at things like the generic ballot. It's tied right now, even with the overwhelmingly negative media coverage that has been out there. You have a tied generic ballot where if you rewind the tape to 2017 at this point in Trump's first term, I think Republicans were down 6 points on the generic ballot in the RCP average.
Well, and we'll get a bit more into this, I think, later, but we asked a battery of questions of, do you trust Republicans or Democrats more on, a little over half a dozen issues? And they pretty much mirror outside of threats to democracy, which is a ludicrous issue. We could have a whole podcast on that, but of real issues that actually affect Americans, like ability to continue with their life, support their family, continue to live in retirement. Like, Republicans are dominating Democrats right now on those issues.
Yeah, if you look at economy and jobs, voters give Republicans an R+2 advantage. Republicans have an R+2 advantage on cost of living. On the border and illegal immigration, it's an R+25 advantage. If you look at crime, R+13, wasteful spending, R+18, and then foreign affairs, it's a little bit narrower at R+2. But I think this gets to a fundamental point, which is voters don't feel like that congressional Democrats are addressing their concerns. In our poll, 41% of swing voters said either the economy or cutting wasteful spending was their top priority. Only 8% of swing voters said threats to democracy was their top priority. But what are congressional Democrats talking about? They're talking about threats to democracy every single night on cable news.
Well, and it's hurt their image too. We've been saying for several months now that Democrats have just an image completely in the tank. But what I found interesting in this May survey is that Republicans and Democrats actually both saw an improvement in their net image. They're both upside down, which shouldn't shock anybody, but they both have a less upside down image than they did a month ago, 2 months ago. Let's swap topics here, John, into topic number 2.
Yeah, so this was a really interesting question. We put AOC's image on the survey, and then we also did Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, and we found some interesting divergences here. AOC is more popular with Schumer. And again, this is of likely 2026 voters. So this is Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And I want your take a little bit on kind of what's going on underneath the hood here. But AOC's net image is at -1, 39% fave, 40% unfave. Schumer is in the basement at a -16, 33% fave, 49% unfave. And Chuck Schumer only has a 27% favorable rating with swing voters. And so you can bet your bottom dollar that he is going to be in a lot of Republican ads for the midterm, similar to how Nancy Pelosi has been the last couple of election cycles. But Brent, do you think that the AOC Schumer dust-ups, are they indicative of a lost party, or is it just sort of the usual infighting that occurs when your party is in the outs? Do you think that AOC really would actually challenge him in a Senate primary?
Well, they say the most dangerous place to be in Washington is between Chuck Schumer and a TV camera. And apparently that's not helping him at the moment. Maybe it did in the past. What I found interesting, because I assumed in that difference in negative image, that AOC is almost even, fave, unfave, and then Schumer's upside down by 16 points. I went to calculate, okay, what is their total name ID, which we always consider the combination of favorable and unfavorable. We say that's your total name ID. They're almost identical name ID. So this really is a difference in that basically the same number of people know who both of these folks are nationally. And Chuck Schumer really is that much worse. Going into the swing voters where you said Schumer's got the 27% favorability, AOC is at 30% favorability. And here's a bright spot for you. Trump is at 47% favorability with these swing voters. So these are, we define swing voters because nobody's going to tell you they're swing voters. So we define swing voters as soft Republican, soft Democrat, or undecided on the congressional generic ballot. That is how we get to the swing voter segment. It tends to be a really good indicative segment there when you look at those folks. 47% favorability for Trump when you've got Schumer at 20 points less favorability with this audience. And then when you go look at independents, old Chuck's at 24% fave, AOC's at 38% fave, Trump at 36% fave. This is a really interesting group of folks where they view Trump and AOC almost identically from a favorability standpoint. But another thing that we asked too is who's the leader of the Democratic Party? And I was a bit shocked that one person crossed double digits. And if we're rounding, Chuck Schumer barely crosses double digits at 10%. Former President Barack Obama, 13% say he is the leader of the Democratic Party. And then when you go look in Democrats themselves, you would think, okay, well, I bet Democratic respondents know who their leader of the party is, and it's really just everybody else who doesn't know who the leader of the party is.
Not so.
Yeah, Kamala Harris at 11%. That is the highest number among Democrats. So even Democrats are more conflicted on who the leader of their party is than the rest of the voters out there in the country.
Yeah, that is really remarkable if you stop and think about that most voters, and it's a small plurality, right? Because we included everybody from Josh Shapiro to Gretchen Whitmer to Schumer in this question,
and old Tim Walz.
But plurality of people think that Obama is still the leader of the Democratic Party years after he's obviously been out of office, and it speaks to the fact that there's a dearth of popular Democrats on the national stage right now. We talked about the numbers for Chuck Schumer. He's incredibly unpopular. Biden, we know from just plethora of polling over the last year, Biden is incredibly unpopular. You have the bombshell book by Alex Thompson and Jake Tapper that is being published this week.
Amazing they didn't maybe publish that or say any of that information during the campaign. Shocker there.
Right. A lot of people in the media look the other way. But there are not very many national Democrats who are popular and who are well known right now. And that's really hurting the party. The issues that they're talking about are not resonating, and they really haven't found the person to carry the torch.
Well, let's move on to the next topic, John. So, we've been talking about a lot of negative news that is mainly on Trump. 92% negative press coverage for Trump. We didn't calculate that. That's what the Google says. But voter optimism is up. And then let's throw a real wrench in this right now. Cygnal does something very unique to any other polling firm, and that is we own an AI platform called Heartbeat, and we do Cygnal emotional analytics. And this actually looks at people's open-ended responses and then assesses against a massive lexicon developed by neurolinguists and psychiatrists and political psychologists that when people say certain words and phrases and in certain combinations, these are the emotions behind those words that they're saying. An open-ended response is a lot more gut response than answering a closed response on a survey. So in asking that, it gives us a really deep, rich look into what are people feeling. Okay, they're telling us this country's right direction or maybe somewhat the right direction, but how are they feeling about this? Because those emotions are really what's going to drive the end result. And when we looked into this emotive analysis, it doesn't paint necessarily as positive a picture compare even just on base comparing positive versus negative emotions. And we look at 10 primary and 100 secondary emotions when we're looking at this. And you've got almost half of voters that are either angry or fearful. And so, and then you have a lower number that are trusting or joy, which are kind of the two main positive emotions, with those really only sitting at 30%. So you can see that there's kind of some softness to this right direction that we have, that it is not just this, it's a heck of a lot better than the point you mentioned at 70+% wrong direction. But the emotional story behind this really tells something a bit different. I dug into the swing voters when we were preparing for this. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is, of course, you had a number in there who were saying threat to democracy, our democracy's under pressure, whatever it may be. And then you go look at those people's responses and you're like, well, yeah, we're never getting those voters. They just may not be happy with Democrats at the moment, but we're definitely not getting them. So when you go look at the segment of folks that, okay, Republicans could go get this group of people, the theme that really stuck out to me was uncertainty, and that there was some confusion and they were seeing chaos. And it wasn't that they hated chaos. They didn't really understand what was the point. What is the end goal of the chaos? And that they were okay with change, but they weren't necessarily understanding why it was happening so fast. And I mean, just think about who you are as a human. Like, nobody really appreciates lots of fast change. All of us can deal with change. We can be resilient. Lots of fast change is stressful. And so that's what really stuck out to me with these persuadable swing voters, where it was this like underlying uncertainty. What do you think voters, why do you think voters are sticking with him? Where do you think there might be some softness there?
Yeah, talking about Trump, sticking with Trump. Yeah, I think part of it is that people want to see how the tariffs play out. And as we'll get to in a little bit later, we asked some questions about tariffs. And really, there's a lot more openness to renegotiating all of America's trade deals than I think the DC bubble would have had you think 2 years ago, right? And so I do think, though, that there's some uncertainty. It's not like negative uncertainty. It's just more almost, I think, kind of neutral uncertainty about, okay, let's see what's going to happen with the stock market. Let's see what happens with the tariffs with China. How are those going to be renegotiated? What does that mean for small businesses? What does that mean for American businesses that really rely on a lot of exports? And so I think that's where some of the uncertainty is coming. But I think what is helping Trump in the White House is that the Democrats and the opposition have really oversold. They've been almost sort of playing off of hysteria. And they're saying the sky is going to fall. Like, we could go into a depression. All of these just really sort of ridiculous and overwrought predictions of what may happen. And you look at it, the stock market is climbing back up. It's pretty clear that we're not really that much in danger of an imminent recession. And so I think now Trump is being able to take advantage of the fact of the sort of the hysteria and the fear-mongering on the left as it relates to the tariff situation.
Well, to that point, one thing that stuck out to me in these results is, we always ask, how much attention are you paying to the news? It was a question that we added to our surveys last year when we realized that some of what was looking like undersampling of Trump voters was actually people who were just not nearly as tuned in. And so we added that question as a way to make sure that we got enough people who weren't tuned in into the surveys. Because if you're really tuned in, you're answering every survey that comes to you. And we had a drop in news attention. So in February, 33% of folks were saying they paid a great deal of attention to news. May was only 28%. Pretty big drop, 5%. It's outside the margin of error, well outside the margin of error. And then we saw an increase in social media, which we kind of wrap up several response options into the social media response option, including YouTube, and a decline in cable of 39% of voters saying that they're getting their news from cable. Those numbers don't match because we let people choose up to three options out of what we have. But, one of the theories in thinking through that is that voters got so pulled into this negativity in the media. Trump was new, second time to being president. He's doing so much. People are paying lots of attention to the news. They're getting very anxious or angry about what's happening. They realize, to your point, the sky is not falling. So they stop paying attention to news. And all of a sudden, everybody's image starts improving when they're not seeing those people or those entities nearly as much. I don't know if you have a different theory than this, but if you're not paying, because we saw an increase in news attention when Trump was like hitting his stride in the middle of 100 days. And now we're seeing less news attention, and then people's opinions improve to go along with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that, when Trump really started shaking up the global economic order and really putting out a lot of stuff out there that really was genuinely new, especially for a Republican president, I think that voters were very tuned in and saying, like, what is this going to mean? Like, this is probably the biggest renegotiation of the global economic order in the last 30 or 40 years. And now it seems like, okay, the Democrats said that the sky was going to fall. It doesn't seem to be falling. It seems like actually, we came to a trade deal with the UK. It seems like we've hammered out a deal with China, and we're going to be able to move forward. And I think people are feeling, maybe there's a little bit more of relaxation. The uncertainty is sort of going into relaxation. And now they're like, okay, we can think about finishing up school and baseball and the summer recess, which is right around the corner for most families.
All right, let's jump to the fourth topic here, John.
Yeah, so everybody's favorite government department, whether it's an official government department or not.
It is. They renamed Obama's digitization office or whatever it was.
The Department of Government Efficiency. And so, it really is interesting because Democrats in D.C. have made Doge and Elon like the number one public enemy, or at least they've tried to do that. And they've held press conference after press conference talking about how supposedly this is just going to like sink the government. The federal government is not going to be able to like operate. And then you have like AOC and Bernie saying we're fighting oligarchy here. And, you know,
what is an oligarchy, by the way?
Right.
I legitimately would like to know the definition.
And is it an oligarchy when the White House has literally floated the idea of potentially raising taxes on the very wealthy, potentially, and the renegotiating tariffs, which, by the way, if anybody paid attention to that, Wall Street was not a big fan of that. So that's the oligarchy you're fighting against? Very interesting.
So what's an oligarchy?
Right. Who knows? And so when we look
Coastal
at the
elites coming up with a word that everybody's like, huh?
Yeah, if they use that in their ads for the midterms,
I sure hope they do.
Republican consultants will all be very happy. So Doge's image right now is at a -4, which is actually a slight improvement from last month. And then when you look at Elon's image in particular, Elon's image is at a -7. And so there's a disconnect a little bit between the priority that voters place on cutting spending and increasing efficiency, and then the slightly underwater image that Doge, but especially Elon, has. So, Brent, how do you think through that? How would you break that down for our audience?
I always like to take a data point and find two other data points to look at it and try to triangulate what's happening. Is this causal? Is this correlative? And what was really interesting to me is that you've got, you know, Elon's image is the worst. It's worse than Trump's. Not that much, but it is worse than Trump's. Doge is a little less worse than Trump's. But then you ask, who do you trust on cutting wasteful spending? And Republicans are at 51% trust over Democrats on that. And, you know, what I think the Republicans have an opportunity to do right now is use this reconciliation process. And because they're going to have to cut, like the whole point of reconciliation is that you can only do this much in tax increase and you have to do this much in expense cutting, or you got to go through the normal terms, which means 60 votes in the Senate. And with these constraints that you have because of the reconciliation process, I think Republicans really need to lean into the gap. And what I mean by that is they've got this trust over Democrats pretty significantly over cutting government waste and spending. And this other image, which is upside down, especially with key voters like independents upside down 13%, swing voters upside down 3%, they actually need to explain in messaging, what are we cutting? And here's why we're cutting it. And here's why we have to cut it, because when we save this money, this is where you get it somewhere else. And this current thing that's being spent is completely wasteful. It's going to these people you hate. And if we cut it, we can actually give it to you instead. And it makes me think of if you recall back, the bridge to nowhere. And Congress was already, you know, decade and a half, or however long ago this was, having conversations about getting rid of pork barrel spending. And for those of you younger people, you're going to have to Google that, like after you get done Googling oligarchy.
Feels like a lifetime ago.
It does. and it may be longer. Just had a birthday, so I'm feeling real old right now. But this pork barrel spending was essentially members of Congress and Senate were coming forth and putting into the budget bill, I'm going to get $10 million for this and $500,000 for this. And it was literal line item budgets directly to things within their district, until somebody put in their budget a bridge to nowhere, which I think actually was a bridge for like 30 people.
I think that was Ted Stevens, the senator from Alaska.
That tracks.
Yeah.
But that kind of became the poster child of why we have to kill pork barrel spending. And Republicans have got to find a couple instances. It makes me think of when I was watching Brett Baier interview all those Doge guys a couple months ago. And
tremendous
I was
interview.
like, if every American could have watched this 1 hour or 30 minute, wherever it was, segment, like they would all be on board with Doge. And that's what Republicans have to do. They've got to bridge that gap between we have the trust on this issue. They don't like Doge and they really don't like Elon. Let's explain the benefit to the voter. And that's something that we do all the time in our message testing is don't just say something in your message test, say it and then tell the voter what the benefit is. Don't leave it up to their guessing as to what the benefit might be. And that's really where they've got to jump in, because swing voters trust Republicans by 36 points on cutting waste. I mean, just a massive, massive difference.
That's a great summary. The only thing that I'll add as a follow-up there is that Doge's image has actually improved slightly with swing voters month over month. And so I think Democrats are really in fantasy land. Like if they think this is going to be the thing that they're going to be able to campaign on and really, is going to bring them the House and maybe the Senate in 2026, I mean, go right ahead and try to make that your main issue.
Yep. All right, last topic before our special segment, John. Republican performance in Congress. So, we already kind of hit on this, and maybe this is a short section here, but I'll just give a quick overview for those who have not read the poll. In March, Republicans had a upside down image of 8 with voters. They now have an upside down image of 1, which is fascinating. I never, getting into politics 20 something years ago, would think the Republicans would have that good of an image and that much better than Democrats. Democrats were in March upside down 14 points in their image. I think we were one of the first firms that really highlighted that and pushed that out there. They're better, but they're still down 9 in their image. And then what's really interesting here is that Democrats have improved with younger men. So I'm kind of tying back to how we started here. Younger men plus 17 points improvement in their image from March to now. Black voters, 16 point improvement with their image. Republicans, where have they improved? Okay, not the place you would expect. Women under the age of 55. They've seen an 8-point improvement. Black voters, a 10-point improvement. So, I think the real moral of the story here, John, is quit paying attention to the news and you'll feel better about everything because as news attention drops, images improve. Republicans have tied the generic ballot now. And for some context, if you go back 2 years to early May of 20...
Trump's first term.
Trump's first term. Thank you for the correction. Is that it was D+6 on the generic ballot. So Republicans are in a significantly better position at this point in his second admin than in his first admin. And some of the groups that also went towards Republicans: married women, union members, Hispanics. Like, keep naming them off. All the groups that you would think would normally be Democrat constituencies. So Republicans have this big agenda, not a lot of time to deliver. How do you think they're doing at this kind of slightly over 100-day mark, and some are quickly approaching?
The trend line is the thing that we always tell our clients is the main thing to pay attention to, right? And so if you go back 2 months ago, Republicans were down 2 points in the generic ballot. And you go back a month, Republicans were down a point, and now it's tied, right? So it's been a positive movement for Republicans. And it's worth just like thinking for a second about what you said a second ago, which is that Hispanics have swung, it's slight, but they have swung a net 4 points towards the GOP on the generic ballot, despite all of the furor.
In a month.
Right. Despite all the furor that's happened recently over immigration and sometimes the hysterical way that the media has covered it. Now, Trump's image has slightly softened with Hispanics. So I do think that there's some reaction there with some Hispanics to how Trump has handled maybe a few things. But when it comes to the generic ballot and the direction of the country, Hispanic voters have actually moved towards the GOP over the last month.
And before we go to our new soft spot special segment here, one thing that I want to highlight is on these trust issues of do you trust the Republicans or the Democrats, the worst that Republicans do with swing voters is a 15-point positive advantage over Democrats. The worst. Like, I went and did all the math in the heat maps. That is the worst that we perform. And then we're at like 30s, 40s points higher than Democrats among swing voters on these various issues we tested.
Yeah, I was speaking with a Democratic strategist recently. It was about a month ago, and he just flat out said, he was like, our strategy is just to kind of let Trump flood the zone, let the White House flood the zone, and then kind of like a boxer, punching left and right. They're just going to depend on him to kind of get exhausted, right? But that's not a strategy, right? Like the American
voters
voters
also never sleeps,
right? And the American public, swing voters, are looking for, hey, what's your alternative? And right now, the Democratic base and the Democratic folks in D.C., they really don't have a strategy to speak to the issues that voters care about.
Or they go have margaritas in El Salvador with gang members and convicted criminals, and on the issue that they're absolute worst with among voters, which is immigration and the border. So new segment here, testing this out, want your feedback, is soft spots. So we're going to focus on soft areas for Democrats and Republicans. What voter groups are gettable for the other party, who's wobbling, who's got kind of some squishy voters in there. We're going to focus mostly this month on Democrats because why not? Good fun to bash on. So, we've talked some about how Democrats are leaderless. They lack a message. But where do Dem voters stand? Where do you see some soft spots for Democrats there?
Yeah, well, I mean, they don't love Chuck Schumer. I mean, he's got a positive net favorability with Democrats, but they love AOC, right? AOC is plus 52 in her net favorability among Democratic voters. And so do I think that AOC is actually going to challenge Chuck Schumer in a Senate primary? I don't know. It would be great television to see it happen. Like, hopefully it does happen. But that's an issue for Democrats, because what you have is an extremely energized left that wants to talk about fighting oligarchy. What is that? And that's not what voters care about. And so there's a disconnect between where the energy is in the Democratic Party and then the issues that they actually need to be providing solutions to for the average voter.
Well, and if you look at folks who lean towards Democrats, they're not solidly in the Democratic camp. They actually trust the Republicans more on border crime, spending, other key issues. So, it's fascinating. And I think we've talked about this on a couple other episodes of the Pulse Pod where, Trump stakes out a position and it's 60, 70, 80% support. And the Democrats cannot help but run to the opposite issue. And if you look at who their base is politically, ideologically, geographically, income-wise, educational attainment, like that's why they're talking about oligarchy, because they actually know what that word means. And I'm no joke, John. You think I'm joking. I literally do not know what the word oligarchy was. And this is the third time you're not telling me what an oligarchy is. And it really sounds made up at this point. And I think regular people voters probably are in my spot, which I do have a master's degree from a somewhat reputable college, and I still don't know what oligarchy means. But all right, let's do our last round here, winners and losers. John, give me a quick winner. Give me a loser.
I'm going to give you two winners and then one loser. Two winners are Trump. His image has held steady despite all the stuff that's happened in the media, the overwhelmingly negative press coverage. Trump's image has held steady. So definitely Trump is a winner. Also, Speaker Mike Johnson. He has done, I think, a really masterful job in kind of shepherding a fairly fractious caucus. And Congressional Republicans' image is much better than Congressional Democrats. And I think the Speaker and his team have a lot to there's a lot of kudos that should be given there. Loser, I would say Chuck Schumer. It's kind of embarrassing when your net image trails AOC's by 22 points among your own voters. And the reality is that Democrats would like to have AOC, not Chuck Schumer, as the U.S. Senator from New York. It's just whether or not that she would actually have enough money to make a go of it.
All right. I'll give you my winner and loser here. First winner is Republicans have tied the generic ballot and are doing 6 points better than this exact same time in the last admin, and completely destroying Democrats on trust on the issues that matter by a lot. Loser is, and I'm going to change that term. I'm going to say, okay, well, let's do a soft spot. And I'm going to say, here's Trump's soft spot here. He is dropping with non-college educated voters. In February, he had a plus 11 image with them. Now he only has a plus 1 image with him. I mean, that is a pretty significant drop. He's made up for it by pulling on some college educated voters. But if we're looking ahead to the midterms, we've got to do a better job explaining some of the chaos and taking out a little bit of the uncertainty. And, there's a large chunk of Trump's base who are with him no matter what. There's a small sliver that matters, that needs to hear a little bit more. They're harder to get to. I understand that. But we've got to fix this non-college educated number. We got to get that back up into double-digit net favorability of Trump, which will translate for us in the midterms to favorability for Republicans. So any final thoughts, John?
One final thought would be that we asked a question related to the courts and their oversight of the Trump administration. And we asked, do you think that the courts are exercising impartial oversight of the administration? 52% of voters said that they did. And so I think right now, the Trump administration has struck a pretty good balance of being aggressive in the policies that they've pursued. And, there have been a couple of times their press coverage, to use a football analogy, has been pretty hard. There's been a flag or two that's been thrown. You kind of adjust and move forward. But I think their current strategy is a good one, but they shouldn't, if they try to move more aggressively, there could be a little bit of a political backlash.
Well, thank you for joining us on the 77th episode of the Cygnal Pulse Pod. Make sure you go to our website, cygn.al. And also follow us on social media at CYGNAL for new numbers, hot takes, and maybe to find out what oligarchy means. So thanks for being with us.